This is part one of a six-part series of webinars to help you use the new Woodcock-Johnson 4 Tests of Achievement and Tests of Oral Language. Each webinar is between 10 and 15 minutes long. Please allow about an hour and a half to watch all six webinars. Let's begin with your decision to add the Woodcock-Johnson test to your assessment plan. It's a good choice for initial evaluations where an individually administered academic assessment is required. This includes evaluations for specific learning disabilities, other health disabilities, and emotional or behavioral disorders. The Woodcock-Johnson Achievement Tests can also provide helpful information in identifying academic strengths and weaknesses and in adding information to your assessment of students' basic psychological processing skills, both necessary components of an evaluation for SLD. The Woodcock-Johnson can also help give some information about growth over time. However, when the student's last assessment was completed using the Woodcock-Johnson 3, you will not be able to use the 4th edition to measure growth over time until the second administration of the WJ4. When might you not need to administer the Woodcock-Johnson? Considering that administering, scoring, and writing up the Woodcock-Johnson can take a few hours, it's good to be sure that this test is the best use of your time. When beginning a reevaluation, it is always important to ask what information you already have before administering the WJ4. Ask yourself what information the WJ will tell you that you don't already know. When we have BAS data, writing samples, and many months of math assignments and tests from the classroom, we may not need additional information to help us identify present skill levels and educational needs. Remember that for reevaluations, we must always report on classroom-based assessments. Since this is required, the WJ should be seen as supplementing this information, rather than vice versa. Remember, too, that initial assessments do not always require an individually administered academic assessment. For example, a student suspected of having an autism spectrum disorder who is struggling socially but not academically. In this case, classroom data might better help us identify whether or not there are academic needs. Another example would be a student with a cognitive impairment. The WJ may not have enough items in this student's ability range to provide useful information for writing an IEP. When planning initial assessments, you have many options for which subtests you'll administer. Remember that you are often evaluating the student with multiple criteria in mind. So if there are academic concerns, follow the SLD plan. If there are few academic concerns, and concerns focus on completing work on time or social emotional behavioral issues, follow the OHD-EBD plan. OHD and EBD initial assessments require an individually administered academic assessment. This is not a requirement for reevaluations. For an initial, you can still be selective by administering only the first 6 subtests. This is 2 subtests in each academic area and omits the fluency test. If fluency is a concern, you could also administer these subtests. For SLD, you only need to test in the areas of suspected concern. If you have data to support grade-level math skills, it is acceptable to administer only reading and writing subtests. Simply indicate reading and writing subtests from the Woodcock-Johnson 4 Tests of Achievement on your evaluation plan. Remember to consider the oral language clusters when you have concerns about reading or writing. More on that later. You may also choose to administer supplemental subtests for initial SLD eligibility if you're trying to determine potential areas of basic psychological processing concern. Many of the supplemental subtests are designed for this purpose. Consult with your school psychologist if you're unsure about administering supplemental subtests to look at basic psych processing. Other disability areas utilize achievement tests as an optional component of their criteria. For physically impaired students, for example, achievement testing is one route for eligibility, but there are other options too. You would want to consult with the teacher of the physically impaired to see if they have a plan for the eligibility criteria, and then look at your existing classroom data to determine if you need any additional testing to identify a student's educational needs. In this case, you could just test in the areas of concern. When choosing subtests to administer, you may wonder if you can qualify students based on broad reading, broad writing, and broad math clusters. Minnesota law and the state's SLD manual do not specifically address this issue. The state manual does include guidelines for scores that are written in a general sense. These include that tests should be designed to measure one of the 8 areas of academic functioning specific to state rule. Since the WJ includes clusters that align more closely with state criteria than do the broad scores, these clusters would be preferable. These clusters are also less likely to miss students who are weak in one area of reading or math, but not the other. In this case, a broad score would be raised by the area of strength and thus not be low enough for eligibility. There are some situations, though, where the broad score may qualify students who may be missed if we only use the specific cluster scores, such as basic reading skills and math problem solving. Sometimes, when all three subtests are low, the broad score may end up being lower than a cluster of only two subtests. Typically, in these cases, one of the narrower clusters, such as reading comprehension, will be very close to the number needed for eligibility, but a couple of points too high. The broad score may be just below the cutoff. If the rest of our evidence supports the student's eligibility for and need for special education, it would be logical to use the broad score. Remember, though, that the broad score should be used only after considering the narrower clusters for each area of concern. This means administering 4 subtests for reading, 4 for math, and 3 for writing. If you think using broad scores would be appropriate for initial eligibility, please be sure to discuss this with your team, including your school psychologist. As in all evaluations, you want to ensure that you have other data that supports your determination of eligibility. The test score discrepancy is only one component of eligibility. When do you give the oral language subtests? First, it's helpful to understand what we mean by a specific learning disability in oral expression or listening comprehension. How is this different from a language disability? This is largely a matter of legal definition. In general, a student with a learning disability has a deficit in one or more basic psychological processes, such as working memory, executive functioning skills, or fluent retrieval of information from long-term memory. A deficit in any of these areas, or other areas of basic psychological processing, could impact how a student gains information through listening or expresses information through speaking. Kids that can't learn by listening are destined to struggle in our classrooms, where so much information is conveyed verbally. Similarly, difficulties speaking clearly impact classroom participation and can impact written expression as well. In contrast, language disabilities tend to be more global than specific. As we know, in order to be eligible for a language disorder, a student must do very poorly on a comprehensive language test. A student with a specific learning disability that manifests in language difficulties might have more specific or less significant language impairments than the student with a language disorder. In order to ensure that we are not missing students who might need specialized instruction, we need to be sure our comprehensive assessments include language subtests when listening and speaking skills are areas of concern. This may occur when there are concerns with reading, writing, and/or following directions. Administer oral language subtests 1, 2, 5, and 6 to obtain the oral expression and listening comprehension clusters. Be aware that the WJ does offer some, but not all language subtests in Spanish. So, who gives the oral language tests? These subtests of the Woodcock-Johnson could be administered by either a special education teacher or a school psychologist. When you need assistance interpreting results, it makes sense that you would consult a speech pathologist. You may find that these subtests serve as a screener when you're unsure about involving a speech pathologist for further language testing. Your speech pathologist will review your testing and help decide if further testing is appropriate. If a speech pathologist is involved with the assessment, you may still choose to give the Woodcock-Johnson language test. If the student qualifies for speech, these subtests will be redundant. However, since students may have language needs that are too specific to meet eligibility for a language disorder, you may find that they are eligible for services under SLD. You may want to write a conditional assessment plan that states that if student does not score below the second percentile on 2 communication tests, 4 oral language subtests from the Woodcock-Johnson 4 tests of oral language will be administered. This could be listed under the academic section with the special education teacher as the examiner. You could also list it under academic assessments and specify that the school psychologist will administer. Due to the strong link between cognitive subtests, oral language subtests, and basic psychological processing, some school psychologists have indicated that they would prefer to administer these subtests. This is a decision for your building team. Remember, too, that some of the language tests our speech pathologists use can be used for discrepancy calculation for learning disabilities. Talk to your speech pathologist and refer to Chapter 8, page 21 of the State SLD Manual for more information. If a student previously qualified under oral expression or listening comprehension, these skills must be addressed upon reevaluation. Just like for reading or math, you start by reviewing existing data on listening and speaking skills. You can look at progress on previous IEP goals, teacher input, and special education teacher observations during service. Do you feel like you have data on the student's current speaking and listening skills? You're looking for listening speaking deficits that are interfering with education. What do you notice about students' ability to follow directions given to the class, to take notes from lectures, to tell you what was discussed after a lesson, to contribute to class discussions? Feel free to consult with your speech pathologist if you're unsure of what you're looking for in your existing data. When testing reveals a need for instruction in listening comprehension or oral expression, you may apply strategies in your repertoire for students with reading comprehension or written language difficulties, or consult with your speech pathologist for additional ideas. Is there a link between the difficulty with listening comprehension and oral language and reading, writing, and math? Can you work listening or speaking into an existing reading, writing, or math goal? Often, intervention will be connected to the basic psychological processing deficit that underlies the disability. When we teach student strategies to compensate for a weak working memory, for example, this may improve their listening comprehension or oral expression. Instruction should begin with the special education teacher. If you do not see progress, consult with a speech pathologist for additional ideas. Only if you still don't see progress should the team consider adding speech as a related service. To wrap up our discussion of selective testing, we've given you a cheat sheet for initial evaluations. This shows the subtests you need to administer to obtain the 8 cluster scores that most closely align with the 8 areas of specific learning disability. The highlighted subtests are new to the WJ4. More on those next. We strongly encourage you to copy the selective testing table from the WJ4 manual and keep it on your desk for easy reference. It can be found on page 14 of the examiner's manual. We have also added it to the list of handouts for this webinar. For reevaluations, we start by asking what we know already. Testing should be done only to fill in gaps. We want to be sure we are not testing to give us information we already have. When you identify areas where you do not have enough data to determine a student's present level of performance and educational needs, you would choose the subtests that you need. Identify them by area on the evaluation plan prior written notice. For example, math subtest from the Woodcock-Johnson 4 Test of Achievement. This is preferable to select subtests from the WJ4. Remember that the same rules do not apply for required tests and procedures for reevaluations as for initial. While the criteria may specify an individually administered test of achievement for initial eligibility, this is not required for reevaluations. This concludes the first webinar.